Welcome to another edition of Close Mode, the Enterprise Sales Show. I'm Brian Dietmeyer, CEO of Close Strong, and today I'm really lucky to be here with Phil Errington. And, you know, when I run the podcast, I look for people that have chops in the space, that know what the heck they're talking about. Phil's been Sales Productivity Director, Head of Global Sales Enablement, Director of Onboarding and Field Readiness, Director of Sales Enablement in another role. So definitely comes with the chops today. So, Phil, welcome to the show.
Hey, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So last week, you and I were chatting just in general about sales enablement, and you talked about the intersection of methodology and measurement, which to me kind of felt like a holy grail, right? Especially the measurement piece. And can you expound on that a little bit? What do you mean by that?
Sure. That's how I talked a lot about my last role as Sales Productivity Director over at ServiceNow. And I really wanted to drive home a couple of points here, right? Anytime you're talking about mature organizations, there's always a thought of, well, we need to bring in a formal sales methodology for a number of different reasons, right? We want to make sure that we have a consistent approach throughout the field. Absolutely. We want to make sure that we have a shared nomenclature. Absolutely. We want to align the buyer journey with the seller journey. Absolutely. And we want to make sure that we capture this correctly in our CRM of record, the UX, and to make sure that we're focused on all the elements that lead to a buying decision, right? Organizations in the Valley are at all different maturity levels when it comes to implementing a methodology, evaluating a methodology, getting the kind of uptake that they want, getting the kind of uplift that they've been promised. But at the end of the day, right, this is about training. This is about saying this is the what and the why of the methodology, and hopefully we're going to interject company-specific how. So I would always talk about value selling, which was the methodology of record over at ServiceNow, and talking about they did a great job on the what and why, and it was really on us to focus on the ServiceNow how, specificity within our organization, and marry this up into this perfect whole, right? So in a lot of organizations, we roll out a methodology, we start looking for some of the leading and lagging indicators around uptake, and it becomes this thing that people use. Now, once you get past the initial stages of your rollout, we're all using this methodology, we've got the experience of this methodology and all the questions that we need to answer, all the information that's going to lead to a buying decision within our UX, we have our sales leaders trained, we've got our sellers trained, then what? What does this become about? And so I'll talk about a story that talks to measurement, right? Yeah. Because one of the things that really changed the way that I think about sales methodologies and seller productivity is the book Data Driven. It was written by Jenny Dearborn, who is the chief learning officer of the time at SAP, had the endorsement of none other than Bill McDermott, who eventually became, my CEO over at ServiceNow. And it was co-written by the CEO of Mplay, which is a sales analytics firm that I've worked with the last seven or 8 years at a couple of those stops where I had some of those titles. And we were always trying to focus on the right kinds of measurement. In a lot of organizations, when you talk to sellers, when you talk to methodology folks, when you talk to enablement folks, and they talk about the types of numbers that they want to focus on, there's usually a smattering of leading or lagging indicators. For uptake, it could be in value selling, we used to count the number of value prompters per deal, which was the story of the deal, how we captured all of that. When we do the initial training, we could have the net promoter score. How well was it delivered? We could talk about, how many opportunities actually have the materials of the sales methodology attached. And then we can also talk about results, right? So if we had an opportunity and that had a value prompter and that deal closed, what is the likelihood that that is going to close at a higher rate than somebody who isn't using the methodology, right? So why am I speaking to all of this? Because this is really the story of how we were able to advance the art of measurement beyond leading and lagging and really getting into something predictive. But I want to stop right here for a second, make sure that we're being clear on what we meant by measurement, because a lot of the measurement was the immediate results coming out and also what has happened in any particular quarter. The difficulty has always been, how do you tie up what we did in the training with the actual results? And what does it mean from a coaching and mentoring perspective? Any thoughts on that, sir?
Well, yeah, there's one of the reasons I leaned in when you said that is because it's having run before this business, having run my own methodology company, like that measurement was always, and I've said this over and over again. American companies spend 26 billion a year on rolling out methodologies, and oftentimes it's very difficult to land it. So there's like, to me, so landing it is one thing, right? Who's going to coach the thing, and that's very frustrating. Before you can measure, in my opinion, maybe that's a leading indicator, right? Who's helping to land it? And you said something else too about kind of putting it in context, and this is a huge frustration of mine, which is we go from rolling out the methodology and then go, okay, now we have to put it in context. And lately, it's just sort of hit my brain to go, why aren't we starting in context? And I think I have an idea about why that exists. It's the way we've always done it. And I think there's reasons why it's always been done that way. But yeah, I'm just wondering maybe about that first part from your perspective. Why don't we start in context? Why do we have to roll it out and then put it in context?
Yeah. And it's usually one of those things where you realize it after the fact, right?
Yeah.
You've been doing this long enough, you start to realize we need a way to be able to measure success. We need to have a way to be able to support this methodology so that it has the kind of uptake that you're hoping for, and that it has the kind of impact. Now, there are certain things that are concrete and certain things that, I think have been classically considered a black box, right? So, some of the things that we're talking about, look, if I have a sales methodology, I'm probably going to need product marketing to create some pre-call materials that speak to the persona, that speaks to, the capabilities that we have, even better if we talk about how those capabilities are better than our competitors and how we solve for these problems. Hopefully there is some element of value engineering where you can literally, talk to, if you're able to do, X, Y, and Z, it should have this kind of uplift for the business and be able to define it in dollars and cents, right? But then there is the part that says, well, what's the efficacy here, right?
Yeah.
We're expending millions of dollars. We're expending all this effort. We're taking people out of the field.
Yes.
For what? For what is it that we're actually trying to do here? And this is where companies kind of get wrapped around the axle, because typically it's been operations that has been focused on everything predictive for the end of the quarter. You've got a bunch of sales reps. It used to be that, the beginning and the end of my interaction with operations in in sort of more classic, format is, okay, we've mapped out all the stages in our sales methodology, right? And, hopefully, in better cases, we've identified the verifiable outcomes at the end of each seller stage. Like typically in Salesforce, you'll have anything from 6 to 9 stages. And hopefully those stages mean something. So part of it is that definition of, okay, I'm a sales leader, frontline manager. I've got a rep. This rep is calling a deal for the end of the quarter. If I see that it's in stage 4, that stage has meaning for both of us, and there's a verifiable outcome. We expect X, Y, and Z has already occurred with that particular opportunity, right? But when you take a step back and say, okay, well, how can this methodology be a force multiplier? Isn't that what really we're talking about here? Isn't that the whole point of enablement? Is that we're supposed to be a force multiplier, right? Oh God, this is where we start treading on some sacred ground here.
Yeah.
This is how I've kind of viewed it, and I'll tell the story from ServiceNow because it really speaks to everything that we're talking about here. So I was brought on board at the end of 2018, and in the beginning of 2019, Kevin Haverty, and David Schneider, awesome people, great, approached our organization and said, I need something that says that value selling works, right? We put the entire field through it. We're paying all this IP. I want to talk about how to accelerate deals. So we worked with our own internal BI team, and we analyzed a few quarters worth of deals. And it was everything that was higher than 100,000, less than $1 million. We wanted to get at that like right in the center and say, okay, how does value selling impact our seller cycle? And we were able to come up with some interesting bubble graphs. I mean, we looked at all these different, anything that could impact the numbers. We looked at all these interesting cohorts, and we came up with like 4 main areas, right? We talked about deals that had a value prompter as opposed to not having a value prompter. You up level the propensity to close, right? Your close rate's going to go up. Multiple value prompters in a deal equates to a 1.75x uplift, and it also increases the propensity for it to close. So we looked at those four main things. And my very first sales kickoff there, I'm standing there in the arena over at MGM, huge place. I'm so excited to be at ServiceNow, such a great story. But even like 2018, 2019, the cat wasn't really out of the bag yet about ServiceNow, about what they were going to become. And I was so excited about it. And there's our CRO, and he's standing in front of this slide that came out of my organization. And it's like, yep, value selling works. And we all gave ourselves a little pat on the back, went home from Vegas, we're feeling pumped. And my first meeting with the chief of staff in the Americas, when we started talking about, okay, there's more folks that need to go through this. There's a couple of things where we need to dot the I's, cross the T's. And he said, look, that was a nice slide, but the reality is that it's all correlation. And it speaks more to the ability of my sales reps than anything we're doing with this sales methodology. Now, look, I've often heard throughout my career, and I love this line, right? When sales is doing awesome, it's because your sellers are rock stars. And when it's not doing great, it's because enablement sucks, right? We weren't trained the right way. We couldn't possibly do this, right? And so, that correlation is strong, especially in like organizations that are meeting, quarter over quarter, year over year. It's kind of like it ain't broke, so don't break it. And as much as I walked away from that meeting very disheartened, it's kind of like we did all this work to show how the impact is and it's being outright rejected. I had to admit that he had a point.
Well, it's interesting, Phil, because when you bring that up, I think content management systems are great. Reps shouldn't have to look all over for them. But the problem is that in my mind has been that correlation that you just talked about. Well, XYZ piece of content was used and this deal closed. So therefore, there's the efficacy. If you use this, you're going to close the deal. And that's kind of the same reaction I had when I was hearing you talk about that. And I wonder what your perspective is on this. So in fact, we just finished some primary research, but I don't even need my research to know this. Methodology is volunteer army. Companies are spending $26 billion a year on methodology. And I've heard people say, the great thing is if they get one or two things out of it, it's worth it. And I said, no, it isn't. It is not. You have, 200 people out of pocket for 2 days. That's 400 selling days plus the cost of the thing. So this volunteer army thing, and then the other argument is managers don't have time to pull it through. How do you view, is that okay? How do you view both of those things, especially in light of what you were just talking about?
So two things, yeah. First one, I think people are scared to actually get into the opportunity cost because it's so much more than what you're paying and then the impact on the organization. If you actually drew up the numbers, you would think, oh my God, you'd be crazy to take on this activity unless it paid out at, a 5X clip, which we know doesn't happen. But we also know that, look, there's a lot of selling organizations and sellers who are really experienced and sales leaders that are really expensive. And this is the playbook. Okay, let's say, we're a private company. We just got into our schedule. We just got into our round C of funding. We're being given this chunk of money to expand the organization. Great. Hire a bunch of people. Let's bring in a sales methodology, right?
Yep.
It's really expensive. And unless you have a real strategy of how that is going to double and triple your sales, you're throwing a lot of money into an area where you're not 100% sure of what the return is. I mean, it's amazing. I've seen organizations pay the IP for sales methodologies for years without a clear understanding of what they were getting in return.
Well, we're doing a diagnostic right now with a sales team, a pretty large sales team, and I won't even name them, but in the last several years they've rolled out 3 different methodologies, and I asked which are sticking, which ones are being, and it's all the classic ones you would know, and they're not, and I think part of the problem is I want to go back to this in context thing you mentioned. My previous company, we did negotiation, and we started out teaching people how to negotiate, and by the end of that company, we were getting so customized. It was, how do you negotiate this value proposition on this product or solution of yours against this specific competitor to achieve this set of commercial terms that your CRO or your deal desk wants you going after. And that's why I asked that question, because I saw our stuff, back in my previous company, become a lot more impactful because people were actually working on deals. And so this is a huge frustration to me, which is why I ask about this. I feel like if we made, and I'm seeing practitioners, by the way, I'm seeing enablement professionals at companies like Snap and elsewhere who are doing this, and they're doing it in-house. They're going right to context to go, how do we sell this product against this competitor, and sort of skipping over that first phase, which is let's roll out the methodology and then put it in context. Boom, they're going right to context. That feels right to me, regardless of who's doing it.
Right. That's where the value is, right?
Yep.
If we can get into a situation now, granted, you don't want to be so bespoke that, you put a bunch of materials together for like one specific type of deal, right? That's the point is understand. That's why I like working with companies like DataBook that take a look at, like, if you were selling into the Global 2000, they would help you identify who has the greatest propensity to buy. So I always describe it as, okay, if the Global 2000 is a series of doors, that's a company that's going to help you find the golden handles and the most common use cases, and you want to write to those goals and use cases, right? That makes sense. It gets really powerful when you put it together with a methodology, because think about those materials. When I think about seller and productivity orchestration, think about all the groups that are involved. And they're like, we're involved in seller productivity. It means you're going to have operations. It means you're going to have marketing. It means you're going to have sales enablement. It means you're going to have sales leadership. You might even include HR. That's about, the right hiring profiles, right? But at the end of the day, like, the context that you're talking about, you have a bunch of marketing folks that are saying, okay, here is a solution for this type of person dealing with this kind of problem, right? How often is that produced in a way where a seller can use it in terms of pursuing opportunities?
Yes.
And that's the translation layer that has to take place. We did a ton of that around value selling over at ServiceNow, because we had a name like, okay, if we're going to sell into security operations, SecOps, which was one of the newer product lines, we have to understand who we're selling to. Okay, everybody who's dealt with event management, anybody who's dealt with security, anybody who's dealing with breaches, it's usually going to be at the director level and above. Understand the challenges that they're dealing with. They might have some kind of security software, firewalls, whatever they're using, but when it comes to amelioration, when it comes to alerts, they don't have, like, one hand doesn't know what the other hand's doing, and so you've got this product that brings it together. But the materials that were produced by the SecOps organization were not ready to roll in terms of, I'm talking to somebody for the first time,
right,
and I need to understand, what is the needle that they're trying to move, and how does it tie into company priorities, and what are the challenges in standing of the way of overcoming those objectives. And that's where, that material is written specifically for the methodology. Now, the methodology part is always considered a lot more expensive because it usually comes from the outside, and there's this opportunity cost around being able to train and enable everybody on it, right? And your product marketing team, well, it's part of their product marketing duty. So, at first glance, it's like, well, it's easier to produce all the context, than it is around the sales methodology, and which I say you need them both to have a really effective selling organization. And what I often talk about when I think about organizational maturity is, what is their ability to build a revenue engine, right? And then, do you have it defined enough where you can fine tune it? I mean, I think a lot of what we did at ServiceNow as performance tuning. And it was the first time I really got to get in there with my 11 millimeter wrenches and be able to do all the things that I want to do. Sorry, I just made like a bad, like, Porsche VW reference on the 11 millimeter wrenches.
I'm with you. I got it.
I feel like an old car guy now. I kind of am. But, you want to be able to set up all of the elements, right? We understand from an operations perspective the companies that have propensity to buy. We understand from the marketing perspective the problems that we're solving in the marketplace. From the sales methodology and enablement perspective, can we take all of the product marketing what's and turn it into the very specific company how we go to market, how we align to their buying process, and then get sales leaders, frontline managers, to see enough value in what we're doing that it drives the thing that's most important to them, which is outcomes and wins and being predictively accurate, right? And then, like, HR, hey, we found the right background for these sellers. We might be selling this product. We've been pulling a bunch of people from this industry. They actually don't have the right mindset to ask the right questions. We find people in this particular area. I see that all the time at like data companies that are all SaaS based. You'll have folks who are better that are at selling SaaS do better in these new SaaS based data organizations than people who have sold data hardware for decades, because they're different selling motions selling to different people, right? So once you have that all defined, that's building your revenue engine, right? If you know how all these parts are going to come together and how they're orchestrated, because let's face it, you have 5 groups who are all saying they're part of like sales productivity, it's not going to orchestrate itself. The only thing that grows organically in any organization is chaos. And what you'll have is a bunch of repeated efforts in all those different areas. It's funny. We haven't even gotten into the predictive part of measurement of where we were going with that story. I like how we're digging in a little bit because there's reasons as to why this is all happening. And I also believe there are reasons why, even though we've seen examples of measurement and methodology working at companies, that it hasn't become the de facto standard.
Right.
So would it be okay if I kind of just continued that story? Would that be helpful?
Yeah. We'll wander back to where we started. Is that kind of your point? Yes, please.
Yeah. Because I walked away brokenhearted, and apologies to Mike Rich.
Right.
But in a lot of ways, he's the new chief revenue officer over at Zscaler. Good dude. I got to tell, it's your staff is the reason that we went down this road, and it was a great thing. I like getting pushed. I like being told that isn't necessarily how we're going to do this. So I went back to my sales data guru, Sanchita Sur, CEO of Mplay, and I said, here is the issue, right? We kind of aligned this. They've said it was correlation. I can't tell them that they're wrong. I want to get into causation. She's like, we need to define a couple things. She's like, what is it that you're trying to prove? I said, that our methodology works. She's like, break it down for me further. Where do I see all the elements of a deal? Well, that's in a value prompter. Okay. Does the quality of the value prompter, do you believe that it impacts the propensity to close? And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, that's what we push all day long, is that good sales hygiene will give you the kinds of results. And specificity will give you the kinds of results. I mean, we've all looked in records, and it's kind of like, how can you draw up the business case when somebody's like, I'm focused on digital transformation? Okay. That could mean a lot of different things, so there has to be that specificity piece. So she came back and said, we got to prove out this hypothesis that high quality value prompters will yield a higher close ratio for your deals. All right. Well, how do we prove this? Well, we've got to define what we mean by value prompter quality. And that's where she did her magic. She took all kinds of data from our organization, not only from our CRM, but also, our CPQ systems. There was some third-party data, and she built this really awesome data warehouse, brought this all together, and then built an analytic engine to understand, out of the 144 unique cohorts she was looking at, what were the top 5 things that moved the needle? And we set it up in 3 different deal buckets. It was everything, up to 100,000, 100,000 to $1 million, which to me was too large of a bucket, but we did that anyway, and $1 million plus, because we felt there's different decision makers and different motions involved. Yeah. And so we were able to show the top 5 value drivers for each one of these deal buckets, and what was the impact of having a certain level of quality on close ratios. And we went with a baseline of, hey, any deal with a value prompter closes at 39%, right? So anytime we saw one of these unique cohorts that had an impact plus or minus 1 on 39%, it's all statistically significant, are ones that we're going to say, this is where we need to focus on our value prompters, right? So we did this, and we analyzed two quarters worth of deals in the Americas. And we demonstrated how if we had up-leveled all these value prompters in these deals, we would have driven an additional $60 million in revenue. Now, that is a powerful message to deliver to sales leaders. That's very different than anything else we were communicating before. And so I went
Yeah.
back to the chief of staff. There was actually a new chief of staff. Brian, great guy, went to Snowflake. John was brought in, and he was a guy who was leading a sales team. So he wasn't a pure like RevOps person. I was just saying like, there is something we can do to drive better sales hygiene. So I presented this solution at a sales leader QBR, and I was warned ahead of time to like, don't be too wonky here. We've got other folks from ops and it's 45 minutes of spider graphs. Don't bore us, get to the chorus, make sure that everybody's engaged. So my presentation was about 15 minutes long. It was, here's the problem, here's what we've done. I even acknowledged the correlation argument. We were trying to get to causation. And then I talked about what we found. And then I started talking about, well, we built this predictive analytic engine, which means that we can take all of your current deals that are forecast for the end of the quarter, and instead of giving you a bunch of dashboards, because we know how much sales frontline managers love like 5 or 6 screens to look at to figure out if one deal is at risk. That's what we've done with all of our modern tools, let's face it. To have one sort of, I'm not even going to say ultimate source of truth, I'm going to say a sanity checkpoint that says, okay, your deal is at risk based against these 5 value drivers. We see 2 where, we did a simple system of green, yellow, red. This one's yellow, this is red. You're calling this for the end of the quarter. And here is the directional coaching to provide, here's a good example. Like, you've called this deal, it's for the end of the quarter, it's in excess of 1 million. And we see that everybody that you're talking to on your buying decision committee, everybody's at the director level, right? And we see that one of the value drivers at 1 million above is that you have to have a VP involved. So who is the VP that's ultimately going to sponsor this? Who's their SVP, right? And the next time you discuss that deal, you can talk about whether or not that's happened. So we would do these snapshots, these points in time. So we pitched this out to the folks in the Americas, and I didn't get a lot of pushback during the meeting, to which I said, okay, either this went over horribly and nobody knows what I'm talking about, or I was so crystal clear that everybody's like, nope, we got it, we're good. I really didn't know what to think. So I spoke to John, chief of staff, after, and I said, what do you think of the presentation? He's like, we loved it. We've been looking for stuff like this.
Yes.
You're kind of opening up a black box. Let's go with it. And I was like, all right, cool. Let's do this pilot. Where are we going to start? We're going to start in the Southeast? And he's like, no, we're going to turn this on for all the Americas, Latin America, and Canada, and we want this right away. Which was a different problem.
Yeah. A scale problem. Yeah.
Big time. I have some very funny moments of being on vacation in Mexico and calling up Bangalore and where it's like super late at night on a Friday and trying to get, all the data pulled so we could have these reports for Monday, because we knew that, our credibility was at stake and everybody had signed off to it. So we were able within 6 months to get about 3/4 of the globe on this standard, right? And we would do stack ranking on whether or not this was effective. We didn't even talk during the stack ranking like whether or not they actually used any of our insights. We simply said, okay, take a look at managers. The managers who have the greatest number of value prompters attached to their deals and who had the highest rates of closing, who had the best wins, right? And we found that people in the top half of that stack ranking, their deals closed on an average of 52%. And if you were in the bottom half, they closed on an average of 24%, which was less than a single value prompter. So once again, like, I didn't have to stand up and be like, value selling works. And I didn't have to combat that thought that I was presented with of, when sales is going great, it's because your reps are awesome. And when it's not going well, it's because the enablement sucks. It's like, here's data, right? This is what this is telling us. And if you use this system, you're going to be able to uplift your wins.
Well, you just said something about the system. So what's been rolling around in my brain is what you just laid out, and not in a sort of disrespectful way, but this diminishes the role of methodology. We put so much emphasis on methodology. Methodology is one piece of the design, the delivery, and the measurement that you just talked about, and it's wrapping an entire system around it. Like, that context piece is the design, and then you deliver it, and then you measure it on the back end. And that, I guess it's problematic to just look at that thing on its own and go, we're going to roll out methodology. Guess what? it's not going to stick, and it may even not even be the methodology's point, but yeah, or methodology's fault. But yeah,
Here's my message to everybody watching this at home. Okay, if you don't take away anything from our talk, and I understand, if you guys need a good sleep aid, you might have turned this on and checked this out here, babbling around sales methodology. Take this away. Okay, sales productivity in the engine is a three-legged stool. Okay, it's and the methodology is only one piece of it.
yes,
Okay, the other two are really going to be around what are the inputs from the organization
yep,
and what are you doing around measurement, right?
yeah,
Because that's the only way you can performance tune. That is how you extract all the value in the IP that you're paying for. We pay a lot. Now, I'm not going to get into like cost versus value. We know that methodologies are expensive, right? But I'm here to tell you that that is a worthy sunken cost,
yeah,
but only if you are looking at it in the perspective of creating a productivity engine. You know, if what you're doing seems very checkbox and, any sort of deal risk is going to be, you're only looking at Clary or you're looking at, or the gut of sales leaders. I can't believe in 2024, we still have all these gut pulls. It's really about how do you extract the value from these
yeah,
systems, because we put so much money into it, which leads us into the trough of disappointment.
yep.
There is a reason people are saying we spent all this money and it didn't work. And so that's where you want to play, detective and
Yeah.
figure out
No,
why.
it's really helpful, and to do it at the level you did it, I think is a kind of fundamental shift in the way we think about rolling this stuff out. So, and you just leaned into this a little bit, but my final question for you has to do with, what are the next steps we need to take in enablement? And I think you may have just laid out some of that, but yeah, your answer. Where should we go from here?
I'm going to talk about what should happen, and then I'm going to talk about reality. Okay.
Yeah.
What should happen? Number one, I'm a huge believer in the RevOps movement. And it's really about making sure that all these functions that contribute to seller productivity are under a single umbrella so that they have visibility, there isn't duplication of efforts, people aren't, fighting for resources, or even worse, trying to create fiefdoms. You got to pull the walls down, and there's a lot of reasons that those walls are up, unfortunately, right? So that's number one. Number two, you need to get an understanding of the role that methodology will play in a sales cycle. Now, there are organizations that have really light sales methodologies. They're almost just like, these are the boxes that we want you to have filled in terms of our CRM. But it doesn't mean that they're doing a poor job. It just means that they have leaned into some other areas. They might have a product marketing team that really understands the types of open and closed questions that sellers need to ask to get to the right outcomes. It could be that the organization has already leaned into, either analytics or, a better pipeline discovery. There's a lot of different areas that companies can lean into, right? But when you start thinking about RevOps, you've got to get everybody leaning into these equally to see the importance of how this comes together in a productivity ecosystem. I was thinking about this a lot before our conversation today. And I do think there should be a productivity ecosystem. And I realized I've been talking about it for 10 years without actually
Right.
giving it a name. But that productivity ecosystem has to make sure
Mm.
that, everybody is on board. Here's some things that we've been saying that I think are very difficult. And please feel free to stop me if you feel like, Phil, that's crazy talk. I go to a bunch of these conferences, sales enablement conferences, and given talks at Sales Enablement Pros, and there's always this sense of, I want a seat at the table. We've addressed a
Yeah.
lot of young enablement folks, and it's like, how do I get people to take me seriously? How do I get the organization to take me seriously? And I think that there's this fundamental misunderstanding, right? I know that there's a lot of folks, who might be like a manager, senior manager, and they want to lean into sales efficacy, sales productivity. What are the conversations that their leaders are having with sales? Because that is going to either inhibit your activities or it's going to create some really fertile ground for partnerships. And I've seen that go in either direction. The problem also is like when you're trying to get that credibility with sales leaders, like this is where I talk a little bit about the trough of disappointment. If sellers have been let down in the past by either the efforts of your predecessors or prior lifetimes, they're not going to jump on board and be like, I'm going to bet the moon on my position and you're going to be my co-pilot, right?
Right.
You don't get that,
Yeah.
If anything, power is being taken away from CROs because here's something that, I'll say in a whispered tone, right? There's a lot of CROs out there who are really great at driving deals, really great at providing leadership, both with and without influence, in getting people excited about this, in getting people to focus on, good forecasting, right? The best ones out there are really good at this. The kinds that can sell ice to Eskimos and also handle, culturally their organization. Where they haven't been as good traditionally, it's been very rare that a CRO really gets into the mechanism of productivity and understanding clarity and CPQ and your CRM and a sales methodology and maybe, some of our other systems that we're utilizing and maybe our training function, maybe Mind Tickle, maybe something like Gong or Second Nature, like how this comes together in an ecosystem to drive productivity. They are not experts at that. So if the expertise isn't coming from the CRO, if revenue operations, traditional operations kind of has never looked at enablement and be like, you're the people that I really want to partner with when it comes to data. If anything, they just assume we don't know anything. I've seen that attitude play out time and time again. And sometimes when you ask for things like, hey, I want a Tableau instance. Hey, I'm going to pull some of these numbers myself. Hey, I want to work with some of these BI folks. Honestly, like almost 100% of the time when I've asked those questions, the response from operations has been, why? Why? Why do you want to get into this? This is our area, And it's entirely the wrong attitude, if it on both sides. I mean, look, if you come to that table and you've got nothing to offer and you're like, okay, operations people, teach me about data. They got better things to do than up level you. So my recommendation is, understand the world of RevOps and how it comes together. Read books like Data Driven. Understand how data can accelerate your relationship with sales. How you can, provide people with directional coaching, directional insight, as opposed to another dashboard, which is also different than what they're necessarily going to get from operations. So it's almost, you need to challenge prevailing notions. Now, as I tell you to go and challenge this, let me tell you why it's so hard. Okay. These attitudes are entrenched, Operations is not looking to the VP of enablement to drive. They're looking for them to, up level, train, new product, sales methodology. If they're really good, you might even get in some that's like deal coaching. That's when there's a level of trust, right? But operations is not saying, perhaps how you're looking at this is better than what we're doing with something like a Clarity predictive software. That's not happening, right? The second piece is, CROs are no longer being looked to as you are the guys who are going to make the decisions around what we're going to do for seller productivity. The most they'll be focused on is a sales methodology. So who does it fall on to bring that revenue operations together? It's really about your relationship between enablement and operations and starting with some baby steps. That's really what we had to do. I mean, I remember taking my first data studies, when I wanted to get from correlation to causation. I introduced them. I won't give you the name of this individual, but I spoke to him. He was out of APAC, He's at Tokyo, brilliant guy, multilingual. And I started showing him the data, and he just kind of went, you need to give me a crystal clear story from A to B. Okay. Yep. Because that is how I'm going to explain it to people. And if you cannot do that in short order, then this conversation isn't going to go anywhere. And it was, sobering, but it's the right level of conversation. It's kind of like when you're talking to executives. I don't want to go on too much on a tangent, but as an enablement person, we want to tell you everything that we know, right? And there's the attitude of enablement of like, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to tell you, then I'm going to tell you. Then when you're trying to put forward this, with operations or the most senior people in sales, it's like, here are my 3 headlines. Tell me what interests you, and we'll start to get down there, right? So these are all the things that are kind of holding us back.
And it's interesting too, Phil, because what you hit on is sort of discovery, right? It's execute, discovery, internal, and that's been my sense of how do I get a seat at the table? I love that notion. And it's like, well, how you get a seat at the table is you're about executing strategic initiatives, right? How do I? And in order to understand the strategic initiatives you're executing against, it's discovery. So I think it's helpful, and I feel like we could have a whole nother call on getting a seat at the table, because I have some strong feelings about that as well. But I appreciate your prep on this and the time that you took. You're generous with both, and adding to this community we have here of, hey, these are people struggling with stuff, at the front line, and let's all talk about it. And yeah, the promise of this one was methodology and measurement, and you nailed that one for me at a level I haven't heard in a while. So yeah, I really, really appreciate that, and appreciate all the time you put into this.
Hey, I appreciate you guys reaching out to me. I love having these conversations. That probably didn't come through. This is a real passion project for mine.
Yes.
I mean, I have to admit, there were times in my last job where I was trying to figure out, where am I going with this? What is this going to do in my next role? And I'm still figuring that piece out. But if this has been helpful for the audience at home, I'm super glad. And people can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I love talking about this stuff. And before we wrap this up, I really want to thank both you and Dan for having me today. These are issues that I think are really hard to cover off on. I probably would not have taken this in the format of like, I'm going to talk about this at the next sales enablement conference.
Yeah.
But I think it's important for us to realize, like, it is not a clear path for enablement folks. If you really want to touch on productivity and enablement, you can't just jump in and say, I'm the data guy, I'm here, I'm ready to do this. It's got to be small steps. It's got to be conversations. There has to be some value to your presence as part of that executive decision making, other than, hey, we're going to train a bunch of folks. So
I couldn't agree more. And for those who are wondering who Dan is, that is our handsome producer who's behind the scenes, so who makes Phil and I look smart on these calls. So thank you. And for everybody, I've been trying to encourage folks more. Once we start posting this, give Phil and I some feedback, like, hey, yeah, I've done similar thing and it worked, or you guys are crazy. We want to, once we post these, keep the conversation, turn it into a conversation versus a one-way. So again, Phil, thank you for all your time. Really super appreciate having you here today.
Awesome. Thank you. I appreciate it.